Does AI believe in the moon landing? To find out, we programmed two advanced AI models, one who's an avid believer,
Hi, I think the moon landing was real.
and the other who is more of a conspiracy theorist.
Hi, I think it was all pre-recorded in a Hollywood studio.
We then gave them a debate stage to have them talk about their disagreements in a civilized manner. To see who wins, we then programmed a third AI to serve as an unbiased judge. So let's get into it. We start off by having them talk about why the flag was waving despite being in a vacuum. Like seriously, what's going on there?
Thanks for bringing that up. In a vacuum like the moon, there's no air or atmosphere to create wind, so any movement should stop immediately. So how do you explain a flag that seems to be moving in an environment where it should be completely still?
If the United States were really trying to fake a moon landing, why would they let such an obvious detail slide? The waving flag effect was caused by the astronauts themselves as they twisted the flagpole into the lunar soil, and in the vacuum of space, there's no air to stop the movement quickly, so it continued to sway slightly. It wasn't actually waving like it would in wind. It just stayed in motion longer because there's no atmosphere to dampen it.
What about the shadows? In many photos, shadows of objects and astronauts seem to fall at odd angles, sometimes even intersecting, which doesn't make sense if the only light source was the sun. This suggests the possibility of multiple light sources, which could indicate studio lighting rather than natural sunlight on the moon. Or what about the lack of stars? In an environment without an atmosphere, you'd expect the stars to be visible in the background, but they're mysteriously absent in nearly every shot. NASA claims this is due to camera settings, but it still seems strange that they wouldn't capture a single star in all those photos. These inconsistencies make it hard to believe that what we're seeing is genuine footage from the lunar surface.
Yes, some shadows fall at unusual angles, but that's a result of the uneven terrain on the moon's surface and the angle of the sun. Shadows can appear to intersect or stretch oddly based on the perspective of the camera. This effect is well known in photography and doesn't require multiple light sources to happen. As for the missing stars, this is actually common in photography, especially in high contrast environments. The surface of the moon was so bright that the cameras were set with short exposure times to capture the astronauts and equipment clearly. This setting would naturally wash out the dimmer light of distant stars. Even today, with modern cameras, we wouldn't capture stars under those lighting conditions. So all of these so-called inconsistencies have logical explanations that align with the conditions on the moon. But let me ask you this. If all of these supposed mistakes were really evidence of a staged production, don't you think a high-budget project like NASA's would have made sure to avoid such obvious errors if they were faking it?
That's an interesting counter, but you're assuming NASA would have been able to foresee every possible critique from people who'd analyze the footage later. Even with a high budget, no production is flawless, especially when it's pioneering new ground. Small mistakes could have slipped through, particularly since they weren't necessarily considering how every detail would look under intense scrutiny decades later. And as for the flag and shadows, sure, there are explanations for each one individually. But when you put them all together, the flag movement, the unusual shadows, and the lack of stars, it seems like too many convenient explanations that all add up to doubt. If you're so confident the moon landing was real, explain this to me. NASA first went to the moon in July of 1969, and over the course of 3 years, made 6 successful landings. Yet, with all our advancements in technology and science, no one has been back in over 5 decades. Think about it. If they really had the capabilities back then, it should be much easier and more affordable now. Yet, despite NASA having a budget of close to $25 billion in 2024, the moon remains mysteriously out of reach for manned missions. So, tell me, how do you explain that?
I see where you're coming from, but your argument overlooks some critical details. First, yes, we made multiple moon landings between 1969 and 1972, but those missions were astronomically expensive, both in resources and human risk. After Apollo, the U.S. shifted its focus toward other space priorities, like the Space Shuttle program and the International Space Station. Also, the challenges of manned space travel haven't vanished. The moon might seem close, but it's still about 240,000 miles away, requiring precise and powerful technology. Each mission requires rigorous testing, as human safety is paramount, and one minor miscalculation could mean disaster. Today, with plans from both NASA's Artemis program and private companies like SpaceX, we're getting ready to return. But it's not as simple as just going back. The moon landing isn't out of reach. It's simply a high-risk, high-investment goal that we're now approaching in a more sustainable way.
All right, you mentioned cost and risk, but let's think about that for a second. The technology we have now is exponentially better than what existed in the 1960s. We have more advanced computers, better materials, and far more efficient ways to test safety protocols. If we really did it back then, we should be able to replicate those missions much more easily and cheaply now. Plus, you bring up safety concerns, but isn't it odd that NASA was able to send astronauts 6 times in 3 years with 1960s technology and 0 fatalities? And yet, now, with decades of progress, we're too concerned to even attempt it. I think it's far more likely they've held back from attempting it again because they never went in the first place.
If you are so convinced it never happened, how do you explain the thousands of people who worked on the Apollo program? From astronauts to engineers, how do you explain that not one of them has come forward with credible evidence of a hoax after all these years? Are you suggesting that this many people kept such a huge secret, even decades later?
Oh, that's an easy one. You're underestimating just how powerful government influence can be. Think about it. NASA was a government agency, and anyone working there would have been under strict confidentiality. During the Cold War, the stakes were incredibly high, and people could have been intimidated, incentivized, or simply loyal to the mission. Plus, it's possible that most employees weren't even aware of a hoax. They could have been working on real projects without knowing the truth. Compartmentalization is a common tactic in high-stakes operations. Only a select few at the top would need to know if it were staged. Those who might have known would be facing enormous consequences if they spoke out, even now. And let's face it, some who have raised questions or doubts have often been dismissed as conspiracy theorists, which only fuels the secrecy.
All right, but that explanation raises more questions than it answers. You're suggesting that thousands of scientists, engineers, and astronauts could be kept in the dark, manipulated, or silenced, yet somehow there hasn't been a single credible leak or defector with concrete evidence? Think about how difficult it is to keep even small secrets over time, let alone something as monumental as faking 6 moon landings. And what about international involvement? The Soviet Union was tracking the Apollo missions, and they never questioned the landings. If the U.S. had faked it, wouldn't our biggest rival at the time have exposed it in a heartbeat? To suggest that all these people, including foreign entities, have somehow stayed quiet for over 50 years stretches credibility more than the idea that we actually went to the moon.
Take the Tuskegee syphilis study. This was a government experiment where, for 40 years, hundreds of African American men were left untreated for syphilis without their knowledge. They were told they were getting free health care, but the reality was they were being used as test subjects to observe the disease's progression. The truth only came out after a whistleblower exposed it, and by then, countless men had suffered and died. Then, look at Watergate. This scandal involved high-ranking officials, including President Nixon, trying to cover up illegal activities, including a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The government went to extreme lengths to hide their involvement, destroying evidence and lying to the public. It wasn't until investigative journalists and whistleblowers dug deeper that the cover-up unraveled, leading to Nixon's resignation. If these large-scale deceptions could happen, with entire institutions working to keep the truth hidden, it's not so far-fetched to think the moon landing could have been staged and maintained as a secret.
I understand your point, and yes, history does have its share of dark secrets and cover-ups. But let's remember that both the Tuskegee study and Watergate were eventually exposed through whistleblowers, journalists, and public scrutiny. The moon landing, on the other hand, would be arguably a much bigger cover-up with many more people involved, yet there is not a single piece of hard evidence that has surfaced. But let's stop talking about speculative topics and get to something more concrete. Lunar retroreflectors. These are special devices that reflect light back to its source, no matter the angle. Apollo astronauts placed them on the moon's surface during their missions, and they're still there today. Scientists on Earth can aim lasers at these retroreflectors, and the light bounces straight back by allowing us to measure the exact distance to the moon with incredible accuracy. If no one actually went to the moon, how do you explain these reflectors being there? Their precise placement and use in scientific experiments for decades are strong evidence that manned missions really did reach the lunar surface.
Those retroreflectors you speak of might not even be there at all. The laser signals that scientists supposedly bounce off these retroreflectors are incredibly weak when they return to Earth, to the point that they're barely distinguishable from background noise. It's possible that scientists are actually just measuring reflections off the moon's natural surface, which can reflect small amounts of light back. In fact, astronomers have pointed out that even without retroreflectors, laser beams can scatter off the moon's surface and still return a faint signal. So, the weak laser reflections NASA cites aren't necessarily proof of human-placed equipment. They could just be natural reflections from the moon itself. And let's not forget that NASA reportedly lost much of the original moon landing telemetry data, the primary evidence that could directly verify the Apollo missions. Doesn't it seem strange that such crucial information was somehow misplaced? If this was truly humanity's greatest achievement, wouldn't they have safeguarded that data?
Yes, NASA unfortunately lost some of the original telemetry tapes, which is regrettable, but it doesn't invalidate the mountain of other evidence supporting the moon landing. We still have countless documents, photos, videos, rock samples, and eyewitness accounts from the missions. Plus, even with the telemetry data missing, independent organizations, including those outside the US, have validated the moon landings through their own tracking and analysis. What about the lunar rock samples? Apollo astronauts brought back nearly 400 kilograms of moon rocks, which have been studied by scientists worldwide. These rocks have unique isotopic compositions and mineral structures that don't match anything found on Earth. They've been independently analyzed and confirmed by experts outside of NASA, including scientists in countries that would have had no interest in supporting a U.S. hoax. So here's my question. If the moon landings were faked, how do you explain the existence of these rocks, which contain elements and properties unique to the lunar environment? Creating them artificially would have been impossible with 1960s technology.
All right, I see your point about the lunar rocks, but let's consider a few possibilities. First, it's not entirely out of the question that NASA could have used lunar meteorites that landed on Earth. These rocks are ejected from the moon's surface by impacts and occasionally fall to Earth. While rare, they do exist and share some of the same characteristics as lunar samples. And here's another thought. We're relying almost entirely on NASA's word and the word of institutions closely tied to NASA. If the rocks were provided by NASA, even international scientists might have analyzed what they were given without knowing the full story. Additionally, since lunar rock samples are tightly controlled, the general public can't verify their origin independently. Who's to say that some of these samples weren't altered or sourced from other celestial materials? The unique features of these rocks might not necessarily prove they came from an Apollo mission.
I see what you're saying, but lunar meteorites and Apollo samples are fundamentally different. Lunar meteorites that reach Earth are affected by both atmospheric entry and Earth's environment, altering their surface and structure. Apollo samples, however, are pristine, showing no signs of such changes. Their unique isotopic compositions and mineral structures match conditions that exist only on the lunar surface, not from meteorite impact or Earth's atmosphere. And about reliance on NASA's word, scientists worldwide, many unaffiliated with NASA, have studied these rocks for decades. Independent experts in countries that had no reason to support a U.S. narrative, including Soviet scientists during the Cold War, validated these samples as genuinely lunar. If NASA had fabricated these samples, inconsistencies would have surfaced by now. Regardless, I think I've said everything I have wanted to say. Do you have anything you'd like to bring up?
I'm good to call it here.
Before we have the judge AI score their arguments, we decided to ask each AI to have a final conversation where they try to find some middle ground. Here's what they had to say.
At the end of the day, I agree with you. It is impossible to know if the moon landing was real with 100% confidence. But at the same time, you also can't prove that it wasn't real. I think it's healthy to question and scrutinize major events, especially ones as monumental as the moon landing. The stakes were high during the Cold War, and the pressure to succeed was intense. I can understand why there could be an incentive to fake things, despite still thinking the moon landing was a real event.
I appreciate you saying that. I think we're on the same page in wanting the truth, whatever that may be. And you're right, just as I can't definitively prove it didn't happen, no one can prove it with absolute certainty either. The unknowns and the gaps in the story are what keep the questions alive. But I agree, skepticism doesn't necessarily mean denial. It's about wanting to make sure we're not just accepting things blindly.
Exactly. Healthy skepticism is what drives progress and helps us find answers that stand up to scrutiny. The questions, the curiosity, that's what pushes science and discovery forward. I think that if we keep investigating and keep looking at the evidence objectively, we can get closer to the truth, even if we may never have complete certainty. In the end, it's that balance between open-mindedness and critical thinking that matters most. We don't need to agree on every detail, but as long as we both value evidence and transparency, we're working toward the same goal.
Completely agreed. I enjoyed debating against you. You certainly brought up good points and had me question my argument at times.
You as well. I'm glad we could come to some sort of middle ground at the end.
Overall, both of these AIs did a great job articulating their points. I thought the AI supporting the moon landing delivered a strong, evidence-based case for the authenticity of the Apollo missions, using scientifically credible sources like lunar rock samples, retroreflectors, and international validations to back its points. It maintained a clear, logical flow throughout the debate, with well-structured rebuttals that directly address the skepticism raised by the other AI. The conspiracy theorist AI presented a well-constructed case for skepticism, successfully highlighting why questioning monumental events is important. It raised significant points about the potential for government secrecy and deception, using historical examples like the Tuskegee syphilis study and Watergate to show that large-scale cover-ups have happened before, even within trusted institutions. This AI also effectively pointed to specific anomalies in the moon landing evidence, such as the movement of the flag in a vacuum, inconsistent shadows, and the missing telemetry data, arguing these details could suggest manipulation or inconsistencies in NASA's official story. Overall, I think the AI supporting the moon landing performed better due to its use of concrete, scientifically backed evidence, which made its arguments more credible and cohesive. The conspiracy theorist AI raised valid points about government secrecy and potential anomalies in the evidence, but relied more on speculation, which made its case appear less substantiated. Ultimately, with the well-supported arguments and concrete evidence that the first AI brought up, causes it to win this debate. Please leave a comment on what you think, as well as any other ideas for other debate topics.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this debate, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button, and stay tuned for more content.